Good afternoon and welcome to the Europe Center. My name is Christophe Crombez and I will be chairing this session today. This is our first event, our first seminar of the academic year. We're actually co-organizing this with the European Security Initiative, and actually my colleague Steve Pfeiffer from the European Security Initiative is the person who basically set up this or took the first steps to setting up this seminar. So I thank him for that. Before I introduce the speaker for today, I would briefly like to turn over to the word to our center administrator, Alyssa. She wants to say a few words. She will say a few words about the practical way we will proceed.
Thanks, Christophe. So just a couple quick housekeeping tips. I know we're all Zoom pros by now, but this webinar is being recorded and you will be able to access it later on our website. And if you have folks who are planning to come and missed it, you can let them know that as well. And we have enabled the transcripts for today's event. And so if you would like to see them, you'll go ahead down to that live transcript button and make sure that you can see that. So you'll just have to adjust the display settings on your end. And any questions that you have can be thrown into the Q&A tool. All right, back to you, Christophe.
Thank you, Alyssa. So the topic of today is the German elections, the elections that took place just this past weekend, and the foreign policy implications of those elections. We have a great speaker to talk about that topic, Rafael Loss, who is at the European Council on Foreign Relations, their office in Berlin, and he's the director there of the coordinator of the pan-European data projects of the European Council of Foreign Relations and their project on Reshape Global Europe. So he will address the foreign policy implications of the German election. He will inform us about the implications of Angela Merkel's departure, the fact that there will be coalition negotiations to form a new government, and he will give his take also on what is no doubt the most exciting, the most surprising, at least if you look at it from the perspective of a few months ago, the most surprising election results in Germany, at least in my lifetime, I would say. So I look forward very much to this talk. Rafael, I think we agreed you talk about half an hour, and then we'll have about half an hour for questions from the audience. So if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box that you can find at the bottom of your screen, and then I will go through those questions at the end of Rafael's talk. So Rafael, the word is yours.
Thanks very much, Christophe. Also on behalf of my colleague Jana, who's unfortunately sick today, first of all, I want to thank Christophe and Stephen for being here with me today, to Alyssa and Shannon for organizing the event, and for the Europe Center for hosting us today. My talk will be structured around 3 parts. I will talk about the perception of German leadership in Europe. I will talk about the German election that happened this Sunday. And then we'll conclude with the expectations toward the next German government. All of this will be based on a public opinion poll that we conducted with the European Council on Foreign Relations in 12 European countries, including Germany, France, Bulgaria, Austria, Portugal, Denmark, Spain, Sweden, Poland, Hungary, Italy, and the Netherlands. All of this polling work was conducted in May and June of this year. And some of the results can also be found in a report that we published just last month called Beyond Merkelism, What Europeans Expect of Post-Election Germany, that was written by my colleague Jana and Piotr Buras, who is the head of our Warsaw office. All right, let me go ahead and share my screen so that you can see what we have come up with. Yes, as I just said, my first remarks will focus on German leadership in Europe. We asked respondents in those 12 countries that I just mentioned, for instance, the question in a hypothetical election over a President of Europe role between Angela Merkel and Emmanuel Macron, the French president, who they would vote for. And we found that overwhelmingly Europeans favored Angela Merkel over Emmanuel Macron. That's even the case in Emmanuel Macron's home country, where we have a difference, 12 percentage point difference in favorability between Angela Merkel and Emmanuel Macron. So we see a sort of general appreciation of Angela Merkel as a leading figure in European politics. She's had 16 years, of course, to fill that role, and she's been significantly less disruptive through her intellectual leadership than Emmanuel Macron. She's focused more on moderating style, rational politics, and coalition building that emphasized the unity of all 27 member states, whereas Emmanuel Macron, of course, as you know, has often advanced ideas about coalitions of the willing and differentiated integration to make progress with a smaller club of member states, even outside of EU frameworks. We also asked participants about how they felt regarding Europe, and we found that respondents who feel particularly European are also more likely to say that Angela Merkel's leadership would be good for Europe in a hypothetical election between her and Macron. We see that respondents who feel less European are also less enthusiastic about Angela Merkel, and the majority of them would say that they would not vote at all in such an election. So we see a certain correlation here between a sense of Europeanness and support for Angela Merkel's style of leadership over the past 16 years. We also asked respondents whether they thought that Angela Merkel has contributed to the world being more or less conflictual during the last 15 years. We found that the majority thought across Europe that she didn't make much of a difference, but there was still a larger share that said that she had a positive impact rather than a negative impact on how much conflict we've seen over the past 15 years. And that is particularly agreed by Spaniards and Dutch. We also asked a question about whether respondents thought that Germany's golden age was in the past, present, or still to come. And here a majority believed that indeed Europe's golden age was in the past. We didn't ask them to place it in a specific decade or time period, but nevertheless, most Europeans and indeed an absolute majority of Germans and Austrians both believe that Germany's golden age was in the past. The most optimistic views came from Spain this time, where indeed a majority of Spaniards thought that maybe Germany's golden age is today. Few Europeans thought that Germany's golden age would be in the future. There was a bit of a nostalgic bend, I think, and a general pessimism towards the future of German leadership and its role and impact on the European stage. In part two, I want to focus on the German federal election that occurred last Sunday. You'll have seen the results. I want to revisit them here briefly for you. But before doing so, I want to go into two questions from a different survey that we ran earlier this year in the spring to illustrate some sentiments that German voters have expressed towards their preferences for European politics. For instance, we included a question about what threats to Europe Germans thought were the most relevant in their voting behavior, and we found that particularly on the political right. So if you look at the AfD, FDP, in particular, that major recession and rising unemployment were seen as grave threats. And we also see on that side of the political spectrum a certain anxiety about continuing lockdowns. If you consider the Greens, then they stand out as the party that is most concerned about a failure to act on climate change. We also see that the CDU, for instance, has considerable support, finds considerable support for the answer option highlighted in green, major terrorist attack or other threat to national security. I think you could see this reflected in the last couple of weeks of the election campaign when the CDU started focusing on domestic security issues. We also asked German respondents about their preferred vision for Europe and for Germany's role in Europe. And we see that a considerable majority, particularly in the Green Party or of Green Party supporters, thought that the EU should be a beacon of democracy and human rights. The starkest contrast, I think, is to be found here with the FDP, which is the Liberal Party, which mostly emphasizes the open and thriving single market. Only AfD voters thought with a plurality that the EU should be dismantled. I think all of those preferences were reflected in the Sunday vote. These are the preliminary results from Germany's federal election compared with the results of 2017. You might be familiar with those percentages already, but they show a significant decline in voter support for Angela Merkel's party, the CDU-CSU union, and a considerable rise in support for the SPD. Earlier this year, they polled around 15% or so, but over the last couple of weeks, the SPD's chancellor candidate, Olaf Scholz, ran a very effective campaign and convinced voters that he was the next logical successor to Angela Merkel, even going so far as emulating her signature hand gesture. The Greens also won in support compared to 2017. But if you look at the polling numbers in May, June, they were polling around 28% when they had just announced their chancellor candidate, Annalena Baerbock, and have still since then declined in the polls, but still a very respectable 15% of the votes compared to 9% in 2017. The FDP also made some gains, minor ones, but nevertheless, for the second time, they've gained double digits in the Bundestag. We've seen that the AfD, the extreme right party, has lost support from German voters. Nevertheless, they are, it seems, a consolidated part of the German political spectrum now. It seems to me that they have sort of hit the floor of voter support in this election. And in some of the eastern states of Germany, they've even become the strongest party in Saxony and Thuringia in particular, although that is less a result of the AfD's strength because they've effectively lost votes there as well, but of the considerable losses of the other parties in comparison. And then we've seen that the left party has also seen a significant decline from 9% roughly to 4.9%. They wouldn't make it across the 5% threshold that the Bundestag has, save for 3 direct mandates that they won. That is a minimum threshold. If a party receives more than 3 direct, or at least 3 direct mandates, then their percentages in second votes will be applied to them, and they can form a regular party group in the parliament. They'll have roughly 39 seats, I think, which is included here, exactly 39 seats. We see that the SPD will represent the largest party group, followed by the CDU, followed by the Greens, the FDP, the AfD, and the Left Party. And then I think for the first time in the history of the Bundestag, we'll have a local minority representative of the Danish peoples in northern Germany. They'll be allowed to send 1 person into the Bundestag. What this means in terms of coalition options, there have been several discussions earlier this year. I think basically everybody expected the CDU, the Conservative Party, and the Greens to form a coalition. Such a two-way coalition would no longer suffice to get them across the threshold with the CDU's significant losses, despite the Greens' gains. What seems more likely is that we'll have a traffic light coalition consisting of the SPD, the Greens, and the FDP, which you can see at the very top. They would have a considerable majority in Bundestag mandates. What would also be possible is a so-called Jamaica coalition between the CDU, the Greens, and the FDP. That has become unlikely though since Sunday because of the significant losses of the CDU. There's a certain leadership struggle and uncertainty about the future direction of the CDU that has erupted again. So they're seen largely as a maybe not so reliable coalition partner. Also, the sort of political momentum in terms of narrative, of course, is supporting Olaf Scholz and his very successful campaign. It would also be possible to have another grand coalition or a so-called Germany coalition, which would be an over large majority, but with sort of the chancellery flipping from the CDU to the SPD. We've also heard, particularly during the campaign, this option of a R2G coalition, which refers to two red parties, the SPD and the Left Party, together with the Greens. But although that was sort of painted on the walls by conservatives as the sort of left-wing spook option, that hasn't really materialized because of the poor showing of the Left Party. Coming to the third part, what to make of all of this, and looking at expectations toward the next German government from those 11 European countries. When asked about which policy areas they most trusted Germans to defend European interests, then you find most support for economic and financial issues, followed by democracy and human rights. Defense and security issues sort of land on third place, and then the sort of more traditional foreign policy areas, relations with the United States, relations with Russia, and relations with China land on the bottom three. Focusing on the economic angle, then of course you'll know that there's quite a diversity of views in Europe when it comes to Eurozone reform, but also the continent's broader trade agenda. But across the continent, there is much support for German leadership in the economy. You can look, for instance, at Spain and the Netherlands. Both say that more than 40% of Spaniards and Dutch trust German leadership in the economy. When looking at democracy, you see a similarly broad support. Populations in Hungary, in Spain, in the Netherlands, and Denmark, all with very different views, support German leadership on democracy. When looking at the three traditional foreign policy areas, then the picture is quite mixed. We see that Hungary trusts Germany with 44% and handling relations with the United States, but finds less support for dealing with Russia and China. Generally, support for German handling of relations with Russia and China finds less support, as I've said before. I think the lowest marks Germany receives here from Poland in all three sort of grand power relationships, indicating a general suspicion of this sort of middling German position, and that we've seen Angela Merkel facilitate over the recent years. And of course, a traditional preference in Poland for close relations with the United States, and a dissatisfaction with the lack of ambition from the German government as of late in embracing Joe Biden, for instance, and even effectively dealing with Donald Trump, who was much liked in Poland. When we correlate those policy areas with perceptions of whether Germany's golden age lie in the past, present, or is yet to come, then those who are of the opinion that Germany's age is in the past are generally also much more disinclined to say that they trust the German leadership on those 6 policy areas, and are much more likely to say that they don't trust Germany on any of them. But the other 2 options, whether Germany's golden age is today or still to come, generally finds much support. We also see that there is a certain gap between what Germans' perceptions of themselves are compared to what other Europeans expect of them. Germans are much less confident that they can lead on defense and security and economic financial issues than are other Europeans. The reverse is true, however, this is particularly stark with handling relations with the United States, where 31% of Germans that they say that they trust their own government, compared to 24% who say the same from outside of Germany. We also asked whether respondents thought that Germany, looking into the future, would become more nationalistic, or whether Germany would become more focused on helping other Europeans. The perception is much more bleak in the other 11 European countries that we polled, where 27% versus 25% say that Germany will become more nationalistic, and German voters thought that, or German respondents thought that Germany would focus on helping other Europeans in the near future, or the next decade. I think this is the last slide that I prepared for you. Indeed, here you can find some additional information about how we conducted the polling. If you have any questions about the methodology, of course, we can address this in the Q&A as well, but I look forward to your questions. You need to unmute yourself, Christophe.
Thank you very much, Rafael. This was a great overview of the work you did on the opinions on Germany and its leadership in Germany and in the rest of Europe. Before we turn to the questions that from the audience, I would like to ask a few questions myself. In the meantime, I would like to encourage audience members to enter their questions in the Q&A function that you can find at the bottom of your screen. I just have two questions that I would like to ask. First, one is not very much related to the data that you showed. One is a little bit more specific and related to some of the figures you showed also. The first one is about the future and how we can expect foreign policy, German foreign policy, to evolve in the next few years. I guess it's likely, as you also pointed out, it's quite likely, highly likely, that the next government will be a government led by the Social Democrats. So when I think back about previous German governments led by Social Democrats, I think there's been quite some differences with respect to foreign policy, specifically with respect to relations with the United States. If I think back, if I think about Schröder, the last Social Democratic chancellor in the late 90s and early part of this century, relations with the US were not all that good. If I go back one more Social Democratic chancellor, then we have to go back to Helmut Schmidt in the late 70s and early 80s. Policies were a lot more friendly towards the United States, and in a way, his foreign policies, the foreign policies that his government pursued, at least, were very much very similar to what a conservative or a Christian Democratic government would have done at that time. So, what do you expect from the SPD and from Scholz now? Do you think that they will pursue a quite traditional foreign policy, very much in line with what Christian Democrats have been, Christian Democratic-led governments have been doing, sort of focusing on more European integration, good relations with the United States? Or do you think that maybe there will be some more trouble ahead in one or both of these areas? That's my first question. The second one is a little bit more specific and related also to something that you showed, and relates to a smaller party, the Liberal Party, the FDP. Your numbers showed that there's quite a high percentage of voters there who don't like the EU very much. And that's also something that's been noticeable in the positions that the FDP has taken in the past few years. They've become quite a bit more Eurosceptic compared to the policies that they pursued in the past, for example, under the since we were talking about the Schmidt era, and if we go back all the way to Hans-Dietrich Genscher and his foreign policy leadership under Schmidt and under Kohl, it was a lot more pro-European. So I was wondering whether you could shed some light on that shift there.
Sure, thanks very much, Christophe. I think those are both very interesting questions, particularly as both parties will likely play a role in the shaping of the foreign policy of the next German government, although it's unlikely that either of them will lead the foreign ministry, because that tends to go to the second strongest party in the coalition government. But nonetheless, they'll certainly have an impact. Yes, I think you mentioned that regarding the SPD, there is a long tradition of strong foreign policy leadership. When you look at Willy Brandt and his Ostpolitik in the late 60s, early 70s, you mentioned Helmut Schmidt. His dual track decision cost him his chancellorship, but very much was in line with NATO preferences, and particularly the US government. And then you look at Gerhard Schröder, who actually used the Iraq war discussion leading up to 2002, 2003 to win re-election in 2002. His foreign minister, Joschka Fischer of the Green Party, then probably provided the first sort of very formative foreign policy experience for me when at the Munich Security Conference in 2003, I think it was, he confronted Donald Rumsfeld, essentially saying that he didn't believe the evidence that the US government presented for making the case for invading Iraq. I think there is some ambivalence in the SPD today about what foreign policy should look like, and that I think reflects differences in the broader population as well, and certainly has mirror images in some of the other parties as well, between a more conciliatory camp that emphasizes good economic relations, particularly with Russia and China. Both are important for Germany for historical reasons, for economic reasons. The relationship with Russia over Nord Stream 2 is something that generally SPD higher ups tend to support. If you look at Gerhard Schröder, for instance, the former or the last SPD chancellor, then he is on the board of the Nord Stream 2 conglomerate and has been highly supportive of this. But even Sigmar Gabriel, who was a foreign minister from the SPD under Angela Merkel a couple of years ago, has been quite outspoken about the positive aspects of this project, and others in the SPD are equally supportive. But you still find voices as well in the SPD that caution that human rights and democracy and rule of law are all factors that should be considered in foreign policy, even as it relates to relations with Russia and China, and that we need to find a sort of more appropriate language to address the challenges that they pose, not only to the international rules-based order, but also to sort of the domestic constitution of democracy in Germany and in other democratic countries in Europe and North America, of course. On your question regarding the FDP and their wavering support for the EU, I think we've seen this over the last couple of years. You're right to point out that the FDP has been a critic of EU policy, particularly as it relates to fiscal issues, economic issues. They're very supportive when it comes to the EU single market, but beyond that, many FDP supporters don't see much value in the EU. They emphasize the economic angle. That can be a bit of a problem when it comes to managing expectations should they become part of the next German government. But for many, I think, leading figures, the sort of EU critical stance reflects their personally held views in the economic realm. But beyond that, there's sort of a lot of tactical maneuvering been going on over the past couple of years as well, to sort of position themselves as a sort of a critical party that doesn't leave too much space to far right parties. Both the FDP and the CDU have tried to sort of walk this line. to contain the AfD. And as you'll remember, the AfD first emerged as a Euro-critical party in 2014, 2015, and only then shifted to a sort of xenophobic and fairly anti-migrant political platform after the migration crisis.
All right, thank you. Steve, would you like to ask some questions?
Yes, thank you, Christophe. And Rafael, thank you for a really interesting presentation. Let me pose two questions. The first is that since the election, you've had this announcement by the Green Party and the Liberals, the FDP, that they're going to try to coordinate and see if they can come up with a common position for when they sit down, I guess, in the coalition negotiations with the Social Democrats or the CDU. But when you look at those two parties, particularly on domestic issues, there seem to be a lot of differences in priority, on tax policy, economics, even on the environment. They do seem to have more, I think, in common on foreign policy. But how hard do you think it's going to be for the two of them to come together and agree on basically a joint presentation to make, which then could allow them to be in a position where they get to choose who the next chancellor will be? And then the second question is, you talked about the two most likely coalitions, or the most likely one being the Social Democrats, the Greens, and the Free Democrats, but the alternative being the Christian Democrats and the CSU, plus the Greens and the FDP. Your polling did some hints at this, but if you had to say, if Europe was given a choice, which coalition would they vote for as the most effective in terms of meeting the sorts of concerns that you were asking them about in terms of economics, finance, defense, and security, and then relations with other major powers? So thank you.
Thanks very much. Maybe let me start with your second question there. I think that there are a lot of different views from the different quarters of Europe when it comes to preferences for the next German government. Angela Merkel has been in power for 16 years, and she was just sort of reliably there. She's had been the longest serving head of state in the European Council. She has been effective in keeping the Club of 27 together, even throughout crises, and that is something that a lot of Europeans appreciate of her. Now, any prospect of such consolidated leadership changing, I think, raises anxieties. But beyond this change in personnel, there are some specific concerns that you've heard from Europeans. If you look, for instance, at potential for reforming the Eurozone or making treaty changes, then I think there were hopes that Olaf Scholz would make the race, and concerns that Armin Laschet, with a increasingly conservative CDU and the FDP, could take the helm, could take Merkel's mantle, because that would essentially prevent any meaningful Eurozone reform going forward, which has become increasingly urgent, also in light of the COVID crisis. When you look, however, at security policy and defense questions, then there's been sort of wide reluctance to embrace a progressive German government under Olaf Scholz. This is particularly worrying for Germany's allies and partners to the east. The SPD and the Greens are very critical of both the NATO 2% spending goal and nuclear sharing in particular. And particularly Poland, the Baltic states consider NATO as the security guarantee that it is. The Greens and the SPD both support the NATO as well, particularly its function as sort of preventing a renationalization of European security relations, and keeping everything integrated into a sort of transatlantic framework, which both the SPD and the Greens support. But nevertheless, there were concerns. You can closely relate this to Emmanuel Macron's ambitions for moving Europe forward. He has this reform agenda when it comes to institutional relationships and making Europe a more social construct. That would find support from the SPD, but little support from the CDU. And the reverse is true of Macron's ambitions for a strategically autonomous Europe that has a strong security component. So regardless of what coalition, I don't think there was a clear preference in any set. Had Merkel run again, I think that the European preference would have been for continued Merkel leadership. But given that that was not an option, the anxiety levels were quite high. And then can you remind me of your first question?
Yeah, the second question would be on how difficult it will be for the Greens and the Free Democrats, Liberals, to come up with a coordinated position that they can then use as the basis for negotiation with either the SPD or the CDU.
Yeah, no, I think extraordinarily, the FDP together with the Greens has captured the youth vote. Both have received 27% among people in the age bracket from 18 to 29, I think. And that wasn't seen as particularly surprising for youth support for the Greens, but regarding the FDP, that was considered as a surprise for many. And that is certainly the cohort that most supports post-election polling questions related to whether there should be change, be it marginal or substantial, or whether Germany shouldn't just really change and that everything is all right as it is. Older voters tended to support the status quo orientation, not overwhelmingly. They also saw need for marginal change, which Olaf Scholz championed during his election campaign. But the Greens and the FDP were more favoring transformational change. But if you look at the fine print, so to speak, then certainly there is a lot of difference between the two parties. I think there is certainly potential for the two of them to converge on a sort of political project of modernization and to look at the state economy relationship, the state society relationship on legal questions, civil rights. The Greens and the FDP are very close, actually. When you look at foreign policy and the emphasis on human rights, they are also very close. But I think the next German government, or sort of meta narrative of any future German government, will certainly be one of climate action, and how this exactly looks like for the Greens and for the FDP. There's quite significant differences. For the FDP, solutions lie in innovation and technology-driven responses, whereas the Greens see a greater role for state regulatory action as well, state-led investment, and so on and so forth. There are, I think, ways to marry both through sort of indirect investment schemes, bond-driven investment, for instance, that does not directly reflect on the sort of sovereign debt of Germany. So both parties, the Greens would get their investment and the FDP would avoid a raise in the German debt level. And I think you find similar solutions, similar technocratic solutions to some of the other differences that the two parties have sort of drawn up in their confrontation throughout the election campaign and over the past couple of years. But we've also seen that the Greens and the FDP work well together in some of the state level governments. So in Rheinland-Pfalz, we have a traffic light coalition with an SPD minister president. And in Schleswig-Holstein, we have a Jamaica coalition with a CDU minister president. And in both, we have Green and FDP personnel that have experience in working together and that will be involved in the coalition negotiations going forward as well at the federal level now.
All right, thank you. I think it's time that I turn to the questions asked in the Q&A box. A couple of questions relate to the perceptions that non-Germans have of Germany and German foreign policy. One question is about Greece. Greece was not included in your data, in your survey, I guess. I've seen some other reports that suggest that Greece may be an outlier, that Greece may be one of the countries where Merkel and her tenure are not considered in a very positive light. There's also a question about other countries outside the EU and whether you have any information as to how Merkel and her leadership were perceived in Russia, in China, and some other countries. I would add one thing to that, specifically with reference to Greece. It struck me that in your figures, the perception of Germany and of Merkel's tenure was so positive in Spain. Spain that you could say also suffered during the financial crisis. And I know that at least in some, the minds of some Spaniards and some Spanish media, Germany was to some extent to blame for that. But then when I look at your numbers, there's quite a bit of trust in Germany in Spain. And even as far as economic and financial policies are concerned, I think your numbers showed that Spain was actually quite positive about German leadership. So could you spend some time elaborating about perception in Greece, some other countries outside the EU, and about the numbers in Spain?
Right. So Greece was indeed not polled by this 12-country project that we've conducted, but in some of our other data-driven tools, Greece certainly is included. So we have a EU27-wide expert survey that feeds into an online tool that we call the EU Coalition Explorer. And here we certainly have Greek views reflected quite extensively. And there you see a certain disappointment with German leadership on a lot of questions. So the direct comparison with Spain is not quite as illustrative, doesn't work quite as much. But yeah, I find it surprising as well that Spanish views are so positive about Angela Merkel's leadership. But then again, the Eurozone crisis is also a while in the past now, and we've seen some other more salient issues emerge in recent years. And Germany's leadership on the migration question, which also affected Spain to a considerable extent, seems to have been appreciated, and that certainly extends, according to our polling, to economic issues, as you just said, Christophe. When looking at other countries such as Russia and China, then both have said following the election that they hope for a return to pragmatic policies, the ones that Angela Merkel has displayed. There has been some disappointment, of course, with Angela Merkel's actions in keeping the European EU27 on board when it comes to sanctions vis-a-vis Russia following the invasion of Ukraine and the annexation of Crimea. That disappointed the Russian leadership. But nevertheless, I think there's a recognition that the next German government might take a different view, at least rhetorically, on human rights abuses in Russia and by Russia and China. That the language will change and that relations to some extent will sour, although economic necessities, I think, structure or provide incentives rather to keep somewhat cooperative relations with both countries' leadership, certainly. When we look at the United States, we've seen the Biden administration seemingly focus on reestablishing relations with Germany. There were reports that the first phone call after inauguration from the White House would go to Angela Merkel, but she declined and instead went to her holiday house on the Baltic Sea, and then took the call on Monday morning. But I think we've seen in the actions of President Biden that Germany certainly has a central role in his strategy for Europe, although that's been shaken up over the past couple of weeks with events unfolding in Afghanistan and the Australia-UK-US strategic security relationship that we've seen, and French disappointment in particular over that plan. I'm not sure what Arab views are, particularly of Germany or the next German government. I certainly haven't followed those, but they seem to have been generally positive towards Angela Merkel's leadership of Germany, her pragmatic and moderating approach, and I think they expect that next German government will follow suit.
Thank you. There's also some questions about the AfD. You briefly talked about it also. They didn't do well at all in the election, and that's quite surprising in a way. If you look at the general trend in Europe, in a lot of countries, the far right has done better and better in recent elections. For a while, that was the case in Germany also at the most recent elections. The media paid a lot of attention to the rise of the radical right in Germany and elsewhere. But then they did very poorly in the end. Well, poorly, I mean, they still consolidated a 10% vote share or something like that. How do you see the AfD evolve in the future? Do you have any explanation for their bad performance or relatively bad performance? Do they have a chance of ever being part of government? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think as I've indicated earlier, the AfD seems to have indeed consolidated as part of the German political spectrum as a sort of factor that others have to wrestle with, which certainly is unfortunate. They've had a fairly corrosive effect on the Bundestag as well. We've seen harassment of female parliamentarians and staffers skyrocket since the AfD entered in 2017. And that's probably going to continue. They've tried during the election campaign to associate themselves with the Querdenker movement, which were conspiracy theorists that emerged in the context of the coronavirus crisis, very critical of any sort of mask mandates, restrictions, vaccinations, a segment of the population that has radicalized over the past couple of months. We've also seen that, yeah, they are strongest in some parts of East Germany, where the CDU and the SPD don't really play a role anymore. Although the AfD has lost votes there as well, but they're still a major force. And we've seen that, although at the federal level, or all parties reject coalescing with the AfD or even cooperating with them on any issues whatsoever, that at the local level and at the state level, there's been some alignment, particularly with the CDU and the FDP. So in Thuringia, for instance, we had elections last year where a FDP minister president by accident was elected as minister president because the AfD pulled a trick and supported him against expectations, and he accepted that vote, even though he realized in that moment that he was not only supported by his own party and by the CDU, but also by the extremist AfD. That led to a bit of a disarray in the CDU in particular. The current defense minister of Germany, Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, was chairwoman of the CDU at that time and resigned over that kerfuffle in Thuringia. At a broader scale, the rise of the AfD has had a huge impact on the CDU. There is uncertainty since the AfD emerged about the proper course of the CDU, whether to continue a sort of rather centrist orientation that Merkel essentially stood for, or whether to go further to the right. We've seen a local candidate, again in Thuringia, run on a CDU ticket, but very much drawing on AfD messages, even going so far as to hint at anti-Semitic codes. He unfortunately lost his election, but he still got 20% of the vote. 20% went to the actual AfD candidate, and then 25% went to the SPD candidate. So luckily that direct mandate was won by a Democrat and not by a extreme right person. But it shows that the AfD as a political force to be reckoned with, and I don't think that the other German political parties have quite found an answer to that problem.
Mm-hmm. All right. Then there's also a question or some questions about CDU and the law that they reached this past Sunday. And what some explanations for that. I would add, is it to a large extent a personal the consequence of the leader they picked? And I would also like to add to that question about the future of the CDU. We've seen in some other countries in Europe that Christian democratic parties that were often sort of the go-to party of governance, the traditional party of governance in countries like Belgium or the Netherlands, where they were in power pretty much all the time, that once they lost power, they sort of lost their way and lost even more votes. So do you have any thoughts to share on the future of the CDU?
I think that's a very good question, and I don't think the CDU has an answer yet. I don't think anyone has. I don't think anyone can explain how they performed so poorly. It's been their worst results since 1949, the first German election. We've had 20 elections and never have they done so poorly. And I think one factor certainly is the candidate that they landed on through a complicated inner party process. There were other candidates that had better favorability ratings, but the CDU landed on Armin Laschet. I think interestingly also a lot of people have described this election campaign as sort of the first real climate election for Germany. We've seen wildfires across Europe. We've had floods in Germany killing more than 100 people. But rather than climate itself becoming a focal point and discussions centering around substantive proposals for how to deal with the climate crisis, it very much centered around the three chancellor candidates as persons, as characters running for office. Even though Armin Laschet, as minister president of one of the areas that was most heavily affected by the floods, failed to appear in any way sort of as capable of leading the country in such a situation, when the president of Germany gave a speech in one of the affected counties, you could see Armin Laschet in the background laughing, and that picture has stuck with him. I think that will stick with him also going into the future. His personal future is very uncertain. He's still the chairman of the CDU at the moment, but that can change, I think, any day, because he's been supremely unpopular with the electorate, and he's led the CDU into their worst results ever. Relatedly, I think also the CDU couldn't really make a case for why, after 16 years in power, they were the ones to trust with modernizing Germany. Armin Laschet often referred to his idea about unshackling German economy and business from bureaucracy. Well, if Angela Merkel and the CDU were in charge over the past 16 years, then they were the ones that shackled German economy and business. So that there's a sort of intellectual disconnect that was very difficult, I think, to get out of for the CDU. And I think all those factors contributed probably to their defeat ultimately. And where it's going into the future, I'm not sure. I think that's an open question for the CDU as well. There's doubt whether a sort of centrist course is the right one, given that the AfD is still political power. There are some that call for a more social and fiscally conservative course. They think that Angela Merkel went too far to the left when she championed the minimum wage, for instance, or the end of conscription, or sort of anathema to conservative worldviews of some of the CDU members and heavyweights.
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you. I'm afraid we're getting to the end of our meeting. Steve, do you have any questions or comments that you would like to add to conclude?
I would just like to ask one last question, if I might, and it
Sure.
comes up in part because the coalition that has emerged is very different from when I was in Germany the first 5 months of this year. And Rafael, it would come back to the question about nuclear sharing, the presence of American nuclear weapons in Germany, and the provision by the German Air Force of a dual capable aircraft. But in say May, the likely coalitions were the Christian Democrats, Greens, and perhaps the Free Democrats, or alternatively the Greens, the Social Democrats, and the Free Democrats. And at least most people with whom I spoke in April and May said either one of those groups would be fairly protective of nuclear sharing. And they said, even in the case of the Greens, which of course was founded back in the 1980s as an anti-nuclear party, that the Greens had particular leadership had positioned itself more towards the center, would be very sensitive to concerns of other allies, particularly the concerns of the Poles and those to the east. But you now have a mix where you have the Social Democrats, the Greens, and the Free Democrats as the most likely coalition. And the two largest of those parties, have opposed American nuclear weapons in Europe. How does this play out now with nuclear sharing? Is nuclear sharing likely to be more endangered than people were expecting back in the spring?
Well, that's certainly a very interesting question, and one that hasn't been raised in the campaigns at all. In fact, foreign policy didn't play any role whatsoever. We've had 3 TV debates between the 3 chancellor candidates, and none raised foreign policy issues. Occasionally they suck in the EU as a sort of bumper sticker, but foreign policy didn't play a role. But before I dive into your question, there was one in the chat that I saw about Hungary's support for German leadership in Europe. And I think Antonia is exactly right there, that because we polled the populations, Hungarians are fairly critical of their own government. That relates to rule of law issues. They largely support the European Union also when it puts out the sticks on rule of law issues and the democratic deconsolidation that Viktor Orban has been driving. So I think you're spot on there. Coming back to nuclear sharing, I mean, of course, there's a difference to rhetoric on the campaign trail and rhetoric or policy action when you are in government. There's a considerable difference. Joschka Fischer, for instance, the former German foreign minister of the Green Party, famously said that there is no green foreign policy, there's only German foreign policy. And to some extent, that's certainly true. Now, there's, I think, green or SPD shading of foreign policy that we can expect. The leading figures seem to support at least the political dimension of nuclear sharing. Consultations in the nuclear planning group and in the NATO Council. There's concern expressed by all parties about the disarray that the international arms control regime is in, and a great demand for consultations, but also constructive co-development of that regime on the international stage. When it comes to the technical component of nuclear sharing, there's as you've indicated, Steve, considerable disagreement. The question will arise soon whether Germany will procure a successor airplane to the aircraft that are currently designated to carry US bombs. And we might see a non-decision and a sort of dropping out of nuclear sharing just because there is no airplane available anymore because they're aged out. I think that would be a fairly unsatisfactory development. I would hope to see a proactive decision, regardless of whether it turns out to be in favor of procuring a new airplane and reaffirming German contribution to the technical component of nuclear sharing, or a decision to not procure them, but then explain why and provide not only rationale, but also ideas about how to either compensate politically or in terms of military capabilities, which all of Germany's parties have avoided so far. There's no discussion about what particular capability nuclear sharing provides and how to make up for that in case we drop out of it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Rafael, for a great presentation. I learned a lot about the different aspects that you discussed. I also want to thank the audience for their questions and for joining us today. Our next event at the Europe Center will be a bit more than 3 weeks from now, on Monday, October 25th. And on that day, we will turn our attention to France, which arguably is the next country that is going to have important elections for the future of the European Union and European foreign policy also in general. So thank you all for joining us, and hopefully we will see each other again in 3 weeks.